The unexpected encounter. Chris pedaled down the familiar suburban streets, the late afternoon sun casting a golden hue over the neat rows of houses. He wasn't in a hurry, just enjoying the warm breeze against his face and the freedom of a weekend afternoon. Life was simple for a 12-year-old boy in this neighborhood, where everyone knew each other, and nothing much ever happened. Except today, something did. As Chris rounded the corner near Mrs. Garcia's house, he noticed her standing on the front lawn, looking distressed. Mrs. Garcia was an elderly woman who lived alone. Her husband had passed away years ago, and though she occasionally exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, she mostly kept to herself. Chris had always seen her as a kind, gentle soul, but today she seemed overwhelmed. "Is everything okay, Mrs. Garcia?" Chris called out, pulling his bike to a stop. Startled, Mrs. Garcia looked up, her face softening when she saw Chris. "Oh, Chris, dear, it's nothing." "Well, maybe it's something. My television stopped working, and I don't know what to do. I was trying to get it outside so the garbage collectors could take it, but it's too heavy for me. I don't think I can afford to fix it." Chris glanced at the bulky TV set perched awkwardly on her porch. It was old, one of those big boxy models that seemed like it could weigh as much as a small car. Seeing her frail figure struggling with it made him feel a pang of empathy. Mrs. Garcia loved her afternoon programs. His mom often mentioned how she talked about the latest episodes during their neighborhood gatherings. "I can take a look if you'd like," Chris offered, hopping off his bike. "I'm pretty good with electronics." Mrs. Garcia blinked, surprise flickering in her tired eyes. "Oh, would you really? That's very kind of you, Chris. I didn't want to bother anyone." Chris smiled, parking his bike by the curb. "It's no bother. Let me see if I can figure out what's wrong." Mrs. Garcia stepped aside, watching as Chris knelt down beside the TV. He examined the back panel, checking the cords to make sure they were all plugged in properly. He could feel her anxious gaze on him, her hands wringing together as if she were trying to hold herself together. "It's probably just a loose connection," Chris said, trying to reassure her. "I'll take a look inside." As he carefully unscrewed the back of the TV, Mrs. Garcia sighed heavily, speaking softly, almost as if she were talking more to herself than to Chris. "This TV was a gift from my husband, you know. He bought it right before he passed. It's one of the few things I have left from him. I was so upset when it stopped working." Chris glanced up, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. Suddenly, this wasn't just about fixing a TV. It was about something much deeper. He felt an even stronger determination to get it working again, for her sake. After a few minutes of tinkering, Chris found the problem: a loose wire that had come disconnected. With a bit of concentration, he reattached it and pressed the power button. The screen crackled to life, and a clear picture appeared. Mrs. Garcia gasped in disbelief, her eyes wide. "Oh my goodness, you did it, Chris. I can't believe it. It's working again." Chris grinned, standing up and dusting off his hands. "It wasn't too hard. I'm just glad I could help." Tears welled up in Mrs. Garcia's eyes as she looked at the boy, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me, Chris. I was so worried I'd have to get rid of it. Thank you. Thank you so much." Chris felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how important the TV was to her. Fixing it had been a small gesture on his part, but it seemed to mean the world to Mrs. Garcia. "Why don't you come inside for some cookies?" Mrs. Garcia said suddenly, her face lighting up with the warmth of an idea. "I just baked a fresh batch this morning. It's the least I can do to thank you." Chris's eyes sparkled. He loved Mrs. Garcia's cookies. He'd had them once before at a neighborhood event, and they were legendary. "That sounds great. Thanks, Mrs. Garcia." As they walked toward her house, Mrs. Garcia placed a gentle hand on Chris's shoulder. "You're a very special young man, Chris. Your parents must be so proud of you." Chris felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. It wasn't often that people said things like that to him. He liked helping out, but hearing it from someone like Mrs. Garcia made him feel like he had done something truly meaningful. Inside, Mrs. Garcia's house was cozy and filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies. Chris sat at the kitchen table as she set a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies in front of him, along with a tall glass of cold milk. "These look amazing," Chris exclaimed, taking a big bite of a cookie. The gooey chocolate chips melted in his mouth, and he couldn't help but smile. "They're just as good as I remember." Mrs. Garcia chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling with joy. "I'm so glad you like them, dear. It's been a long time since I've had someone to bake for." As they sat and enjoyed the cookies, Mrs. Garcia began to share stories about her life. She talked about her late husband, who had been a police officer in their community. Her voice softened with emotion as she spoke of him, and Chris could see how much she missed him. The house must have felt so quiet and empty without him around. Chris listened intently, his heart aching for the kind old woman who had been living with so much loneliness. He realized that maybe fixing the TV wasn't the most important thing he had done today. Maybe the real help he had given was just being there, spending time with her. "I'm sorry you've been feeling lonely, Mrs. Garcia," Chris said gently. "It must be really hard." Mrs. Garcia smiled at him, her eyes misty with gratitude. "You're a very kind boy, Chris. Your visit today has brightened my whole week." Chris beamed at her words, feeling a glow of happiness deep inside. He hadn't just fixed a TV today. He had made a difference in Mrs. Garcia's life, and that felt even better than anything else. As they finished their cookies, Mrs. Garcia's eyes twinkled with a new idea. "You know, Chris, you're welcome to visit any time you like. I always have fresh cookies, and I'd love the company." Chris's face lit up with excitement. "Really? That would be awesome. I'd love to come visit you again, Mrs. Garcia." Mrs. Garcia reached out and gently squeezed Chris's hand. "You've brought so much joy into this old house today, Chris. Thank you for that." Chris left Mrs. Garcia's house feeling lighter than air. His heart swelled with pride and joy, knowing that he had made a real difference in someone's life. As he pedaled home, the golden light of the setting sun seemed to shine a little brighter, casting long, warm shadows across the quiet suburban streets. But what Chris didn't know was that this was just the beginning. By the next day, everything would change, and the kindness he had shown Mrs. Garcia would lead to an unexpected visit from the police. The knock at the door. Chris awoke the next morning feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He couldn't stop thinking about his visit to Mrs. Garcia's house the day before. It wasn't just about fixing the TV or the delicious cookies. It was the way Mrs. Garcia had smiled, the way her eyes lit up when the television flickered back to life. That look of gratitude and relief had made Chris feel like a hero, something he didn't often feel in his everyday life. As he came down for breakfast, the usual chatter of his family filled the kitchen. His mom was busy flipping pancakes, while his dad read the morning paper. Chris grabbed a seat at the table, his mind still drifting back to Mrs. Garcia's stories of her late husband and the quietness of her house. "How was your ride yesterday, Chris?" his mom asked, placing a stack of pancakes in front of him. "You were gone for a while." Chris's eyes brightened as he told his parents about fixing Mrs. Garcia's TV and how she had invited him in for cookies. He didn't leave out a single detail, from the loose wire to the stories she'd shared about her husband. By the time he finished, his mom's face was glowing with pride, while his dad nodded approvingly. "That was very kind of you," his dad said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "It's good to help out neighbors, especially someone like Mrs. Garcia. I bet you made her day." Chris grinned and stuffed another bite of pancake into his mouth, pleased by their reaction. He had indeed made Mrs. Garcia's day, and that thought kept a smile on his face all morning. Later that afternoon, Chris decided to head outside. He had some homework to finish, but the weather was too nice to stay indoors. He grabbed his basketball and headed toward the driveway, figuring he'd shoot some hoops before diving into his assignments. As he bounced the ball, The rhythm of it hitting the pavement was soothing, allowing his mind to wander back to Mrs. Garcia's grateful smile. But just as he was getting into the groove, a loud, unexpected knock echoed from the front door. Chris paused, his hand mid-dribble, and looked toward the house. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his parents were out running errands. The knock came again, this time more insistent. Curious, Chris jogged over and pulled open the door. His heart immediately jumped into his throat at the sight of two police officers standing on the porch. Their presence was overwhelming, their dark uniforms and serious expressions intimidating. "Are you Christopher Johnson?" one of the officers asked, glancing down at the clipboard in his hand. Chris swallowed hard, his mind racing. Had something happened? Why were the police at his door? "Ah, yeah, that's me," Chris stammered, gripping the edge of the door. "Is something wrong?" The officer who had spoken, a tall man with a square jaw, gave a small nod. "We received a call concerning an incident involving you yesterday." Chris's heart sank. An incident? He quickly thought back to the previous day, trying to figure out what could have gone wrong. "I don't think I did anything wrong." The second officer, a woman with short blonde hair, stepped forward. Her expression was softer than her partner's, but there was still an air of seriousness about her. "We just need to ask you a few questions. Mind if we come inside?" Chris hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was happening, but he nodded and stepped aside to let them in. The officers entered the living room, their eyes scanning the space as if they were assessing every corner of the house. "Did something happen to Mrs. Garcia?" Chris asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his stomach twisted with worry. Had she fallen or gotten hurt after he left? The male officer sat down on the couch, resting his clipboard on his lap. "No, nothing like that," he said, glancing at his notes. "But she did call us earlier this morning. She mentioned that you had helped her with her television yesterday." Chris nodded quickly. "Yeah, I fixed it for her. She said it wasn't working, so I checked the wires and got it running again." "Why? Did I do something wrong?" The female officer smiled gently, trying to put him at ease. "No, Chris, you didn't do anything wrong. Mrs. Garcia spoke very highly of you. She said you were a big help." Chris exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Relief washed over him. "So, why are you here then?" The male officer shifted in his seat, his expression turning more serious again. "Mrs. Garcia is very grateful for your help, but she became concerned after thinking more about what happened yesterday." "Concerned?" Chris's brow furrowed. "About what?" "She said you were very polite and helpful, but something didn't sit right with her after you left," the officer explained. "She noticed some things out of place, and she thought it was better to be safe than sorry." Chris's mind raced, trying to make sense of the officer's words. Out of place? Like what? "She mentioned a few personal items were missing from the living room," the female officer said softly. "Things that were there before you came to fix the TV." Chris felt a jolt of shock run through him. "What? No, I didn't take anything. I would never do that." His heart pounded in his chest, the room spinning slightly as panic set in. "We're not accusing you of anything, Chris," the male officer said, raising a hand to calm him. "We're just here to investigate the situation. Sometimes things can get misplaced or moved without people realizing it." Tears pricked the corners of Chris's eyes. The thought that Mrs. Garcia, the kind woman who had thanked him and given him cookies, thought he had stolen from her made him feel sick. "But I didn't do anything wrong," he insisted. "I just fixed her TV, and then she gave me cookies. I didn't take anything, I swear." The officers exchanged a glance, and the female officer gave him a reassuring smile. "We believe you, Chris. We're just following up on the call. It's possible Mrs. Garcia was mistaken. We'll go talk to her again and try to clear this up." Chris nodded, still feeling the weight of fear pressing down on him. "I can come with you," he offered quickly. "I'll talk to her. Maybe I can help explain." The male officer shook his head. "That won't be necessary right now. We'll handle it from here. But if we need to ask you any more questions, we'll let you know." Chris stood frozen as the officers made their way toward the door. His hands trembled slightly, and his mind swirled with confusion. He had only wanted to help. How had everything gone so wrong? "We'll be in touch," the female officer said as she opened the door. "Try not to worry too much, Chris. These things have a way of working themselves out." But Chris couldn't help worrying. As the door clicked shut behind the officers, the warm afternoon suddenly felt much colder. What if Mrs. Garcia didn't believe him? What if the police didn't clear this up? How had something so simple turned into such a big problem? Chris stood in the quiet of his living room, his heart heavy with fear and confusion. He hadn't done anything wrong. But now, everything was out of his control. A web of doubt. The house felt unusually quiet after the police left, leaving Chris standing alone in the living room, grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. The officer's visit had shaken him more than he cared to admit. Mrs. Garcia had seemed so grateful yesterday, so full of warmth and kindness. How could everything change overnight? Chris hadn't stolen anything. He knew that in his heart. But the fact that she had called the police filled him with a sense of dread and disbelief. He sat down on the couch, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of it all. He had only been in Mrs. Garcia's house to fix her TV, nothing more. They had talked, shared stories, and eaten cookies together. Why would she suddenly think he'd taken something? The thought weighed heavily on him, pressing down like a physical burden. As the afternoon wore on, Chris found it hard to concentrate on anything. His homework sat untouched on the kitchen table. The basketball he had planned to shoot around lay forgotten in the driveway. His mind was too consumed with worry. What if the police didn't believe him? What if Mrs. Garcia didn't believe him? What would his parents think if they found out the police had come to their door? Just then, the familiar sound of the front door opening jolted him out of his thoughts. His parents were home. Chris felt a surge of panic. Should he tell them what had happened? Would they be upset or disappointed in him? His heart raced as he heard their voices in the hallway, talking and laughing about their day. "Chris, are you home?" his mom called out from the entryway. Chris took a deep breath and stood up, forcing himself to walk into the kitchen where his parents were putting away groceries. His mom turned to him with a smile, but her expression quickly shifted to concern when she saw the look on his face. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, her voice gentle. Chris hesitated, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to pretend nothing had happened, but he knew he couldn't keep this to himself. Not something this serious. With a shaky breath, he finally spoke. "Mom, Dad, the police came by earlier." His dad, who had been placing a carton of milk in the fridge, froze mid-motion. He turned to look at Chris, eyebrows raised in surprise. "The police? Why? What happened?" Chris felt the words tumble out in a rush, as if he were trying to get rid of them as quickly as possible. He explained everything, from fixing Mrs. Garcia's TV to the police showing up at their door because she thought something had gone missing after his visit. His voice trembled as he spoke, the fear of what his parents might think gnawing at him. When he finished, there was a long silence. His mom and dad exchanged a look, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and confusion. "Chris," his mom began, walking over to him and placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you sure you didn't take anything? Even by accident? Maybe something fell into your backpack or your pockets without you realizing it." Chris shook his head vehemently. "No, I swear, I didn't take anything. I was only there to fix her TV, and she even invited me in for cookies. She seemed so happy when I left." His dad, who had remained quiet until now, sighed and sat down at the kitchen table. "This sounds like a misunderstanding, son. We know you, and we believe you, but misunderstandings can sometimes get complicated. Did the police say what was missing?" "They didn't say exactly," Chris replied, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. "They just said Mrs. Garcia thought something was out of place after I left. But I didn't do anything." His mom squeezed his shoulder gently. "We believe you, sweetheart, but we're going to need to clear this up. Maybe we can go over and talk to Mrs. Garcia together. Explain everything. I'm sure she'll realize it's just a mistake." Chris wasn't so sure. If Mrs. Garcia had been worried enough to call the police, what if she wasn't willing to listen to him? What if things were already too far gone? The next day, Chris was determined to fix the situation. His parents had reassured him that they would help, but the idea of clearing his name weighed heavily on him. He couldn't stand the thought of Mrs. Garcia, a woman he had helped, thinking of him as a thief. That afternoon, Chris stood nervously outside Mrs. Garcia's house. His mom had offered to come with him, but Chris had insisted on going alone. He didn't want to look like he needed his parents to defend him. This was his mess, and he wanted to clean it up himself. Taking a deep breath, Chris knocked on the door. His heart raced as he waited, his thoughts swirling with anxiety. What if Mrs. Garcia didn't want to see him? What if she was still upset? The minutes felt like hours as he stood there, waiting for a response. Finally, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Garcia appeared. She looked different today, more tired, more wary. Her usual warm smile was gone, replaced with a hesitant, almost guarded expression. "Chris," she said slowly, her voice not quite as welcoming as it had been before. "What brings you here?" Chris shifted uncomfortably, feeling his palms grow sweaty. "Mrs. Garcia, I just wanted to talk to you about what happened. The police came by my house yesterday, and they said you thought something was missing. But I didn't take anything, I swear." Mrs. Garcia's eyes softened a little, but there was still a flicker of uncertainty in them. She hesitated, glancing down at the ground before looking back up at him. I don't know, Chris. After you left, I noticed some things weren't where I thought they should be. I don't want to believe it, but..." Chris's heart sank. She didn't believe him. Not completely, anyway. "Please, Mrs. Garcia," he pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. "I only wanted to help. I didn't touch anything except the TV. I wouldn't steal from you. I know how much the TV meant to you, how much your husband meant to you. I would never do something like that." Mrs. Garcia's face softened further, the doubt beginning to fade. She sighed deeply, rubbing her temples as if she were trying to make sense of everything. "I know, Chris. I don't want to think you would do something like that. But when you live alone for so long, and things seem out of place, you start to worry. Maybe I was too quick to jump to conclusions." Chris felt a wave of relief wash over him, but the tension in the air still hung like a heavy fog. He could see that Mrs. Garcia was conflicted, torn between her initial suspicions and the trust she had in him. "Is there any way I can help?" Chris asked, his voice full of earnestness. "I don't want you to feel like you can't trust me. I just want to make things right." Mrs. Garcia looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she gave a small, tired smile. "You've already done more than enough, Chris. I think I might have been wrong to jump to conclusions. I'm sorry for causing you so much trouble. It's just, when you're old and alone, you get scared easily. I shouldn't have called the police so quickly." Chris let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "It's okay, Mrs. Garcia. I understand." But even as the tension seemed to lift between them, there was still a nagging feeling in the back of Chris's mind. If Mrs. Garcia hadn't misplaced the items herself, then what had really happened? Why had she felt something was out of place? As Chris walked home, his mind buzzed with unanswered questions. The situation wasn't as clear-cut as he had hoped. Something was still off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. The unraveling mystery. Chris walked back home, his feet dragging on the pavement, his mind swirling with doubt and confusion. Though Mrs. Garcia had apologized and seemed to believe that it might have been a misunderstanding, Chris couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Something still wasn't right. Why had Mrs. Garcia noticed things out of place? Could it really have been a simple mistake? Or was there something more to this that neither of them could see? The following days were anything but normal. Chris went to school, tried to focus on his homework, and even hung out with his friends. But the thought of what had happened with Mrs. Garcia hovered over him like a dark cloud. Every time he passed her house, a wave of unease washed over him. He didn't know what it was, whether it was guilt, fear, or something else. But he couldn't stop thinking about the whole situation. The worst part was that his friends didn't understand. When Chris tried to explain what had happened, they shrugged it off, telling him not to worry about it. They said that if Mrs. Garcia had apologized, it was over and he should just move on. But Chris couldn't. There was something about the entire thing that felt unfinished, like a mystery waiting to be solved. A week passed, and Chris decided he needed answers. He couldn't keep living with a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. One afternoon after school, he made a decision. He was going to investigate. Maybe Mrs. Garcia had missed something, or maybe there was more going on than either of them realized. As Chris sat at the dinner table that evening, his parents chatted about their day, but Chris barely listened. His mind was already forming a plan. He decided that after dinner, he would go back to Mrs. Garcia's house, not to accuse her or make her feel uncomfortable, but just to see if there was something they had both missed. Maybe he could help her retrace her steps and figure out what had really happened. After finishing his meal, Chris asked his parents if he could go for a quick bike ride before it got dark. His mom raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You've been acting a little distracted lately, Chris. Is everything okay?" Chris nodded quickly, not wanting to raise any alarms. "Yeah, Mom. I just need some fresh air. I'll be back soon." His dad chimed in. "Just make sure you're back before sunset, all right? It's starting to get cold out." Chris grabbed his bike and pedaled down the street, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. When he arrived at Mrs. Garcia's house, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He wasn't sure if this was the right thing to do. What if Mrs. Garcia thought he was being nosy? What if he made things worse? But his desire for answers pushed him forward. He rang the bell. After a few moments, Mrs. Garcia opened the door, her face lighting up when she saw Chris. "Chris, dear, what a pleasant surprise. Come on in." Chris smiled, feeling a bit of the tension ease from his shoulders. "Thanks, Mrs. Garcia. I just wanted to check on you, see how things have been." Mrs. Garcia's expression softened as she ushered him inside. "That's very sweet of you. I've been doing all right. You know, I've been thinking a lot about what happened last week, and I'm still not sure what went wrong. But I'm just glad we cleared it up." Chris nodded, his eyes scanning the living room as he entered. Everything looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place or suspicious. "Yeah, me too. I was just wondering, do you remember where you were when you noticed things were out of place? Maybe we could figure it out together." Mrs. Garcia frowned slightly, her brow furrowing in thought. She led Chris over to the couch, where she had been sitting the day everything happened. "Well, I was sitting here watching TV when I first noticed. I had some knickknacks on that shelf over there." She gestured to a small shelf by the window. "And I thought one of them was missing. But then later, I found it in the kitchen. That's when I started to feel uneasy, like maybe something else had been moved or taken." Chris walked over to the shelf and looked at the small collection of trinkets and keepsakes, old figurines, picture frames, and souvenirs from years gone by. Everything seemed intact, but Chris's curiosity grew. Could it have been an innocent mistake, or was something more going on? "Do you think anyone else could have been in the house?" Chris asked cautiously, not wanting to alarm Mrs. Garcia. "Maybe when you weren't paying attention." Mrs. Garcia shook her head. "No, I don't think so. I haven't had any visitors besides you, and I always keep the doors locked." Chris stood in the middle of the room, deep in thought. He couldn't help but feel like they were missing something. Some piece of the puzzle that would explain why Mrs. Garcia felt so uneasy. He walked around the room, scanning every corner, looking for anything that seemed out of place. And then something caught his eye. A faint scuff mark on the floor by the window. It was barely noticeable, but Chris knelt down for a closer look. It looked like the kind of mark you might make if you dragged something heavy across the floor. He glanced at Mrs. Garcia, who was watching him curiously. "Mrs. Garcia, did you move anything by the window recently?" Chris asked. She frowned, shaking her head. "No, I don't think so." "Why?" Chris pointed to the scuff mark. "There's a mark here, like something heavy was moved. Did you notice anything out of place near the window?" Mrs. Garcia walked over and looked at the mark, her face growing pale. "Oh my, I didn't even see that. I haven't moved anything in weeks. What do you think it is?" Chris's heart raced as he stood up, his mind piecing things together. "I don't know, but maybe someone else did." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mrs. Garcia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. "You don't think someone broke in?" Chris's mind raced, remembering that the police had only asked about his visit. They hadn't considered the possibility that someone else might have entered the house. The idea that a burglar could have slipped in unnoticed while Mrs. Garcia was preoccupied sent a chill down his spine. If someone had been inside the house, it explained why things felt out of place, and why Mrs. Garcia had been so unsettled. "I think we should call the police again," Chris said, his voice steady but urgent. "If someone broke in, they need to know." Mrs. Garcia nodded slowly, her face drained of color. "I'll call them right now." As Mrs. Garcia dialed the police, Chris felt a surge of determination. He had come to clear his name, but now it seemed like there was something bigger at play, something that needed to be solved. He wasn't just helping Mrs. Garcia anymore. He was uncovering the truth. Moments later, the police arrived. The same officers from before stepped into the house, but this time their expressions were more serious, more focused. Chris explained what he had found: the scuff marks, the possibility that someone had moved things around. The officers listened carefully, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. "We'll take a closer look," one of the officers said, motioning to his partner to begin examining the room. "It's possible that there was a break-in, and we'll need to investigate further." Chris stood by Mrs. Garcia's side as the officers worked, feeling a mixture of relief and tension. He had done the right thing by coming back. And yet, the realization that someone had possibly entered Mrs. Garcia's home without her knowing sent a shiver down his spine. Who would do such a thing? And why? The officers spent nearly an hour going over every inch of the living room, dusting for fingerprints, checking the windows and doors for signs of forced entry. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers approached Chris and Mrs. Garcia. "There are signs that someone may have tried to force open a window in the back," he said. "It's possible they got inside, but didn't take anything valuable. Sometimes burglars get spooked and leave before they can steal anything." Mrs. Garcia's face went pale, and she sat down heavily on the couch. "I can't believe this. I had no idea." Chris felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was bittersweet. He had helped solve the mystery, but it wasn't the outcome he had hoped for. Mrs. Garcia had been right all along. Something was wrong in her house, and it wasn't Chris. As the officers finished their investigation and left, Mrs. Garcia turned to Chris with tear-filled eyes. "I don't know how to thank you, Chris. I never would have figured this out on my own. You've been such a help to me, and I'm so sorry for doubting you." Chris smiled gently, feeling a deep sense of pride. "It's okay, Mrs. Garcia. I'm just glad I could help." But as he left her house that evening, one thought remained in his mind. Whoever had broken in might still be out there. And Chris wasn't sure if this mystery was truly over. Shadows of suspicion. The unease lingered long after Chris left Mrs. Garcia's house that evening. The revelation that someone had broken into her home unsettled him more than he let on. Though the police assured them it was likely an isolated incident, something about the situation felt wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something just beneath the surface. The next morning, Chris sat in his room, staring at his textbooks but unable to focus. His mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Garcia's pale face, the look of disbelief when the police found signs of forced entry. The thought of someone sneaking into her house while she was right there made his skin crawl. And the scuff mark by the window. It seemed like a small detail, but it had unraveled everything. What if there were other clues they hadn't noticed? Chris grabbed his phone and texted his best friend, Marcus, explaining the situation and asking if he'd be up for helping investigate. Marcus was the kind of friend who could be counted on for anything, especially when it involved solving mysteries. Chris figured an extra set of eyes might help spot something the police or Mrs. Garcia had missed. A few minutes later, Marcus replied, "I'm in. Meet you by Mrs. Garcia's house at 2." Chris smiled at the message, feeling a bit lighter. He wasn't alone in this anymore. With Marcus by his side, maybe they could figure out what was really going on. By the time Chris arrived at Mrs. Garcia's house that afternoon, Marcus was already waiting on his bike, a look of excitement mixed with determination on his face. "So, you think someone really broke in?" Marcus asked as Chris walked up. Chris nodded, glancing at the windows of Mrs. Garcia's house. "Yeah, the police said they found signs by the back window. But nothing was taken, and it still doesn't make sense to me. I feel like there's something we're missing." Marcus looked thoughtful for a moment. "You think maybe whoever it was got scared off before they could take anything?" "That's what the police think, but why would they have bothered coming in if they weren't going to steal anything?" Chris asked, his voice low. "Something about it just doesn't add up." Marcus hopped off his bike, a determined gleam in his eye. "Then let's figure it out. You think Mrs. Garcia will mind if we take another look around?" Chris shook his head. "She trusts me now. I think she'll be okay with it." They knocked on Mrs. Garcia's door, and a few moments later, she appeared, smiling weakly when she saw Chris. "Chris, Marcus, it's good to see you. Come in, please." As they entered, Chris noticed that Mrs. Garcia seemed more tired than usual. The recent events had clearly taken a toll on her. "I was hoping we could take another look around, Mrs. Garcia," Chris said gently. "I just want to make sure we didn't miss anything. Is that okay?" Mrs. Garcia nodded, her expression grateful. "Of course, dear. I appreciate all the help you've given me. I'm still shaken up about the whole thing." Chris and Marcus began their investigation in the living room. They carefully examined the shelves, the window, and the scuff marks that had tipped Chris off in the first place. They retraced the steps the police had taken, checking for anything that might have been overlooked. But everything seemed in place. There was no sign of further disturbance. After searching the living room, Chris led Marcus to the back of the house, toward the window the police had examined. The window looked normal at first glance, but when they inspected it more closely, they found faint scratches on the latch. Chris frowned, pointing them out to Marcus. "See that? Someone tried to force this open," Chris said. Marcus nodded, crouching down to get a better look. "Yeah, but there's no sign they actually got in through here. It's like they tried, but something stopped them." Chris felt a surge of frustration. If someone had tried to break in, why hadn't they succeeded? And if they had gotten in some other way, why wasn't there any more evidence? Just as they were about to give up, Marcus's voice broke the silence. "Wait a minute. Look over here." Chris turned to where Marcus was pointing. On the side of the house, near the back door, there was something faint but distinct, a series of footprints in the dirt, leading away from the house and into the nearby trees. They were small, almost invisible now, but clearly the marks of someone who had been there recently. "Do you see that?" Marcus asked, his voice rising with excitement. "Someone was definitely here, but it looks like they left through the woods." Chris's pulse quickened. This was the first real lead they had. Whoever had been at Mrs. Garcia's house hadn't gotten in through the window, but they had been there, walking around the property. "Maybe we can follow the tracks," Chris suggested, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. Mrs. Garcia, who had been watching from the porch, came over, her eyes wide with concern when she saw the footprints. "Oh dear, do you really think someone was walking around here?" Chris nodded, glancing at her. "I think so. But I don't know why they didn't take anything. Maybe they were watching the house, trying to figure something out." Marcus stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. "Let's follow the tracks and see where they lead." Chris and Marcus moved cautiously, tracing the faint path of footprints into the woods behind Mrs. Garcia's house. The woods were dense and overgrown, casting long shadows over the trail. Chris's heart raced as they ventured deeper into the trees, the sounds of the neighborhood fading behind them. After several minutes of following the tracks, they came to a small clearing. At first, nothing seemed unusual about the spot, but then Marcus pointed toward something near the base of a tree. "Look there," he whispered. Chris squinted in the fading light and saw what Marcus was pointing at, an old, worn backpack, partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves. Chris felt his pulse quicken. It was dirty, like it had been there for a while, but someone had clearly left it behind. Marcus cautiously approached the backpack and knelt down to open it. As he unzipped the bag, Chris held his breath. Inside were various items: a flashlight, a pair of gloves, and a small notebook. But what stood out most were the papers scattered at the bottom, some of them crumpled and torn. "What is all this?" Marcus murmured, pulling out the papers and handing them to Chris. Chris scanned the pages, his eyes widening in shock. They were detailed maps of the neighborhood, sketches of houses, including Mrs. Garcia's, with notations about times of day, windows, and doors. There were also dates, each one next to a particular house, as if someone had been planning something over a long period of time. It's like someone's been watching these houses," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper, "including Mrs. Garcia's." Marcus frowned, flipping through the notebook. "These notes are creepy. Whoever wrote this has been watching the neighborhood for weeks. But why? And why didn't they take anything?" Chris felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just a random burglary attempt. They were dealing with someone who had been planning, watching, and possibly waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to show this to the police," Marcus said firmly, zipping the backpack back up. "This is way bigger than we thought." Chris nodded, his mind racing. Whoever had been stalking the neighborhood had left behind a trail of evidence, and now it was up to them to stop whatever was coming next. As they hurried back through the woods, Chris's thoughts turned to Mrs. Garcia. She had been right to feel uneasy all along. Someone had been watching her, planning something sinister, and now they had the proof. But the question still lingered. What had stopped them from carrying out their plan? And were they still out there, watching? The truth revealed. Chris and Marcus hurried back to Mrs. Garcia's house, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The backpack they had found in the woods was more than just evidence. It was a roadmap of danger, proof that someone had been watching the neighborhood, possibly planning a string of break-ins or something far worse. And Mrs. Garcia's house had been one of the targets. As they emerged from the woods, Mrs. Garcia was waiting on her porch, her worried eyes scanning the tree line. The moment she saw them, she rushed down the steps, her hands trembling slightly. "Did you find something?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris nodded, holding up the worn backpack. "We found this hidden in the woods. There are maps of the neighborhood inside, drawings of houses, including yours. It looks like someone's been watching you." Mrs. Garcia's face went pale as she looked at the backpack. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my goodness, I can't believe this. Someone was really watching me." Chris and Marcus exchanged a glance, their faces grim. "It looks like it," Chris said gently. "But we don't know why. We need to get this to the police. They'll know what to do." Without another word, they walked back toward Chris's house, where his parents were waiting. Chris felt a pit of dread forming in his stomach. How was he going to explain this to his parents? But he had no choice. This had to be reported, and his parents needed to know what was going on. When they arrived at Chris's house, his mom was sitting on the front porch, reading a book. She looked up and smiled when she saw the boys, but her smile quickly faded when she noticed the worried expressions on their faces. "Chris, what's wrong?" she asked, standing up and walking toward them. Chris took a deep breath and explained everything. The scuff marks, the footprints, the backpack they had found in the woods, and the maps of the neighborhood. His mom's face grew more and more concerned as he spoke, and by the time he finished, she looked almost as shaken as Mrs. Garcia. "This is serious," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to call the police right away." Chris's dad, who had been working in the garage, came over when he heard the conversation. After hearing what Chris and Marcus had found, he immediately went inside to call the police. Within minutes, the same officers who had visited Mrs. Garcia before were back at their house, but this time their expressions were far more serious. One of the officers, Officer Daniels, took the backpack from Chris and examined the contents. His face grew grim as he flipped through the pages of the notebook, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the maps and notations. He exchanged a glance with his partner before turning back to Chris and Marcus. "This is a significant find," Officer Daniels said. "It looks like whoever's been watching these houses has been doing so for weeks, maybe even months. The fact that they left this behind means they were probably scared off before they could act." Chris swallowed hard. "Scared off? You mean, like, they might have seen us?" Officer Daniels nodded. "It's possible. Burglars often keep an eye on a place for a while before making their move. They look for patterns, when people leave, when the house is empty. But something must have spooked them. Maybe it was your visit to Mrs. Garcia's house, or maybe they realized someone was onto them." Mrs. Garcia, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What do I do now? Am I safe?" Officer Daniels gave her a reassuring smile. "We're going to increase patrols in this area. We'll be keeping an eye on your house, and we'll investigate the woods more thoroughly. If you notice anything unusual, anything at all, you should call us immediately." Chris felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with lingering unease. The police might be watching now, but the fact remained. Someone had been planning something, and they had gotten close. Too close. The officers left, taking the backpack with them as evidence. Chris, Marcus, and Mrs. Garcia stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling over them. Mrs. Garcia turned to Chris, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "I don't know how to thank you, Chris," she said softly. "You've done so much for me. First with the TV, and now this. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found those footprints." Chris smiled weakly, but his mind was still spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Whoever had been watching Mrs. Garcia's house might have been scared off, but there was always the chance they would come back. That night, Chris found it hard to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined shadows creeping around the neighborhood, watching from the darkness. He kept hearing the echo of the police officer's words. They look for patterns. The next morning, as Chris ate breakfast, his mom walked into the kitchen with a concerned look on her face. "The police called," she said, her voice tense. "They found more footprints in the woods. They think someone might have been living out there, keeping an eye on the houses." Chris froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Living out there? Like a camp or something?" His mom nodded. "They found an old tent and some supplies, but it looks like whoever it was cleared out when they realized the police were onto them. They're going to keep searching the area, but for now, it looks like whoever it was is gone." Gone. Chris felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. It was good to know the police were taking the situation seriously, but the thought of someone living in the woods, watching his neighborhood, still sent chills down his spine. Over the next few days, life slowly returned to normal, but the events of the past week lingered in the back of Chris's mind. He continued to visit Mrs. Garcia, making sure she was okay, and they even laughed together about how everything had started with a broken TV. One afternoon, while sitting on Mrs. Garcia's porch, Chris finally asked the question that had been on his mind. Mrs. Garcia, do you think they'll ever come back? The person who was watching your house. Mrs. Garcia sighed, looking out at the quiet street. I don't know, Chris. But I do know one thing. Thanks to you, I feel safer than I ever did before. You have a good heart, and you've been there for me when I needed it most. Chris smiled, feeling a warm sense of pride fill his chest. He had started this journey thinking he was just fixing a TV, but it had turned into something much bigger, something that had shown him how important it was to care for the people around him. That night, as Chris lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. He had faced fear, suspicion, and uncertainty, but in the end, he had uncovered the truth. The danger had passed, and the neighborhood was safe again. For now. And though the shadow of that mysterious figure in the woods might always linger in the back of his mind, Chris knew that no matter what came next, he would be ready. Because sometimes, being a hero wasn't about fixing things or solving mysteries. Sometimes it was simply about being there when someone needed you the most. And in that moment, Chris knew he had done exactly that.